Hello, can everybody hear me? Just put
Yes.
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 Ah, thank you.
Yes.
For those that can't hear me, because I
Yeah.
know I have received a couple of messages, if you feel free to go back out again and come back in. Hopefully that will help to rectify any issues that are going on with your computers.
So if I mute it,
Yeah, I'm muting you all. Okay, we've got quite a number of people in the room today. We've currently got 248 people already on the call, and we're expecting a lot more to join us very, very shortly. So let me introduce ourselves. We're the Neighbourhood Watch Network, and we're the umbrella charity for Neighbourhood Watch. And this week's webinars are around not on our doorstep, talking about different types of crimes that we don't recognise in our day-to-day lives, and so they're hidden crimes. And so today we have Lizzie Muir from, pardon me, who is our community engagement officer, who will be talking to you about modern slavery and human trafficking today. So let me go through the next slide, which is around housekeeping. So housekeeping, we want your microphones on mute to enable everyone to hear, so that there's not lots of background noise when people are talking. Please turn your cameras off to enable maximum bandwidth. This enables less disruption for you, as well as for the call itself. If you can put any questions that you have into the chat, both my colleague Ruby and myself will be going through those during the course of the presentation and trying to answer some in the chat, and then we'll be putting some to Lizzie. Be kind and courteous towards others at all times, especially within the chat. And our speakers are unable to comment on individual cases. So if you have got individual cases that you need addressing during the presentations, the speaker will talk to you. We'll actually say where you can actually go and get some extra help. So please bear with us today. We've got quite a number of people. We've got over 300 on the call already. We will be letting people in, but it would be really great if to welcome, pardon me, I've got a bit of suddenly my cold's come back. But to introduce you to Lizzie Muir. So Lizzie.
Hi. Hello.
We can hear you now.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me. Are we waiting for any more people, or shall I make a start?
If you make a start, Lizzie, then what we will do is we'll just continue to let people in.
Wonderful. No, that's great. Okay. And I will just share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my slides? Can I have a thumbs up from you, Cheryl? Can you see my slides? Perfect. And you can see the big presentation, not just my desktop. Wonderful. Well, it is so wonderful to be with you all today, and thank you so much for coming in and listening to my talk on this rather pressing issue, modern slavery. And as Cheryl pointed out, modern slavery is found on our doorsteps, but it's also a global issue. So while I'll be focusing on giving you as much examples and information on the UK as possible. I'll also highlight the global aspect of modern slavery because we can't ignore it. Often what happens in the UK is contributed to and affected by things outside of the UK, especially when it comes to modern slavery. So firstly, just a little bit about us as a charity. So we were founded in 1839, and we are the oldest human rights organisation in the world. We were founded by Thomas Clarkson, who was a well-known abolitionist. I'm sure many of you have heard of him, along with 11 other abolitionists at that time, some of which were in fact Quakers. 9, I think, were Quakers, and the other 3, including Thomas Clarkson, were Christians from other denominations. So our roots are really founded in the abolition movement of the 1800s, and we tackle the root causes of modern slavery. So we argue and suggest that the main causes of modern slavery are poverty, discrimination, and weak systems of law. And just to unpack those for you, if you think about poverty, if someone is in poverty, oh, I think someone is drawing on my screen, I can't tell, but if you are, please, I don't know how to stop it. Can you see the blue lines? Is that just me, Cheryl? I don't know. I'm not sure. I'll keep going, but yeah, just make sure you're not annotating on the screen so that people can read all the information. But yeah, so one of the root causes of modern slavery is poverty. And if you're in poverty, you won't have access to the same opportunities as other people because of economic difficulties. And so it'll often make you more vulnerable to being exploited. You're going to be more desperate to leave that situation of poverty. So you're going to say yes to opportunities that seem too good to be true, and people will take advantage of that and use that to exploit you. So that's poverty. And then there's discrimination. If you think about discrimination, it's often that people who are the most marginalized in communities, minorities, for instance, are discriminated against. And that means that they will face people trying to exploit them time and time and time again. So they will face more opportunities for exploitation than other people, but they may also be living in poverty. And so it may mean that they're not only desperate to leave that situation, but there are more people trying to exploit them than normal. And then there's also weak systems of law. So when governments fail to protect their citizens from modern slavery, that could be by not having strong enough laws of protection or not having strong enough laws to prosecute people engaging in modern slavery, but also not enforcing those laws. You can have a law that outlaws modern slavery and exploitation, but if you're not enforcing it, traffickers are going to continue trafficking, and people who are exploiting people are going to keep doing that. So all 3 of these things we say are the root causes of modern slavery. And we work with our global partners to work towards sustainable and long-term changes. And I'll give you some examples later on. But that's just a little bit of information about who we are and the causes of modern slavery. But what is modern slavery? Well, here is quite a helpful definition for you. So we would say modern slavery is when an individual is exploited by others for personal or commercial gain. So it's exploitation of an individual by another for that other person's personal or commercial gain. And they could be tricked, they could be coerced, or they could be forced, but ultimately they lose their freedom. And so if you have any questions on that definition at the end, please keep notes of them and we'll have question time afterwards. But that is the main definition we use of modern slavery. People who are in modern slavery will be forced to work. They'll often be owned or controlled by an employer, and they'll often be treated as an object, not as a human. Some might be bought and sold as property. And as I mentioned, they won't have any freedom, not even the freedom of movement. So it's really important to clock. And it's just worth noting that a lot of people, when we talk about slavery, think about historical slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And whilst it's really important that we don't repeat the mistakes of our past and the horrors of our past, it's also important to note that slavery didn't end in 1806 or 1834 when the Abolition Acts came in. It merely transformed into many different forms of modern slavery. And so what we see today is about 50 million people living in modern slavery. That's about 1 in every 150 people. But also during the transatlantic slave trade, over its 400-year span, it's estimated that about 12 to 12.8 million people were enslaved. So that's over the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade, whereas today, as I mentioned, there's about 50 million people. So it's massively increased and grown, partly because of definitions of modern slavery, but also we live in a system, in a world where exploitation is embedded in many systems and many sort of different organizations, supply chains. It's really embedded into the world and how the world operates. So I'm just going to touch on the different forms of modern slavery. So there are 7, and here I'm just going to touch on how they come into play in the UK. So firstly, there's domestic servitude. So that's when someone is living in a house. They're normally living and doing chores around the house, like cooking or cleaning, looking after children, looking after elderly grandparents. And the most common people in domestic servitude are immigrants who come into the UK, whether through regular means or irregular means. They come into the UK and their passport or their visa is taken away from them and used as a means of control to keep that person in that situation. It's very hard to spot domestic servitude because often people in your neighbourhoods who will be living in domestic servitude won't have freedom of movement. As I mentioned in the previous slide, they don't have freedom. But you can spot them. They might be very nervous to talk to you. If you spot someone who's showing signs of physical or psychological abuse, look out for that. But they also won't have their passport or their visa. Once their visa expires, it will be used as a means of controlling someone. If you go to the police, your visa's expired, you're going to be deported, you might be put in prison. Not only that, we'll hurt your family back home because we have your passport, we have your information, we know who you are, we can find them and hurt them. And these are some of the things that people living in domestic servitude are threatened with. And so it's one of the biggest forms of modern slavery in the UK. And then there's forced and child marriage. This is one of the largest forms of modern slavery in the world. And just a note on forced and child marriage, it's about informed consent. If you can consent to a marriage because you know what marriage entails, you know the responsibilities of marriage, and you're happy and you're willing to enter into that marriage, then it's not forced, it's a happy marriage. But a forced and child marriage would be when someone doesn't understand what the marriage is, or they do not want to marry that person and they're forced to marry them. They may understand what marriage is, but they're forced into it against their will. But children cannot give informed consent because children do not understand the main responsibilities in marriage. And so it's really important that we talk about them together. And then there's forced labour. That's when someone is forced to work against their will. And that does happen across the UK. It can happen in nail bars, car washes, it can happen on farms picking fruit, but it can also happen with people in drug trafficking in county lines. I think you've heard about county lines before, but with county lines we see people, especially children who are marginalised and excluded on society, being taken advantage of gangs and forced to work for gangs delivering drugs across different areas of where they live and neighbourhoods. And so they're forced to do that against their will. And then we see child slavery. Again, someone who is engaged in county lines who's under the age of 18 is in child slavery and in forced labour. They're a child and they're forced to work. But it's really important that we differentiate between child labour and child slavery. Often people will conflate the two, but it's important that we separate them. So with child labour, you might have to go and work to earn money, but you're given something in return for your labour. Children should not be in labour. They should be in school. They should have access to being a child, being free, playing with their friends, colouring if they want to colour, playing games, but an education primarily. And if you are in child labour, you will not have access to that. But the difference between child labour and child slavery is exploitation. So a child in child labour, they may get income, they may get access to certain things in the workplace, but if you're in child slavery, you'll be exploited. You won't receive anything for that.
Sorry, Lizzie. Sorry, could I interrupt for just 2 seconds?
Of course.
You are echoing. I was wondering if you could possibly turn your camera off, and if everybody else can turn their cameras off, just for now, just so that the sounds can be returned. It just sounds like you're in a goldfish bowl at the moment.
Oh no, of course I can.
Thank you so much.
Is that slightly better? Is that any better?
That should be okay, yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay. If everybody else, I know everybody's saying no, it's still echoing. But please bear with for everybody. Thank you.
Oh, okay, I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, I can't see the chat functions. Thank you for that. So yes, child slavery involves exploitation. You won't be given access to anything. You won't be given anything in child slavery. You'll just be exploited. You'll be forced to work against your will and given nothing in return. And then we have human trafficking. Many of you will know about human trafficking. There are different forms of human trafficking, such as sex trafficking and drug trafficking. But to give you a definition of human trafficking, it is the transportation of a person from A to B for the purposes of exploitation. So you could be moved across borders. You could you could be moved across borders. You could be moved down your road from a house to another. But human trafficking is the transportation of a person from A to B for exploitation. And often human trafficking is the means by which other forms of modern slavery occur. So you might see someone trying to find a better life from another country, and at point A, where they're from, they will be tricked, and someone will say to them, "Oh, if you come with us, we'll be able to give you a job in the UK where you'll get a good income, you'll be able to support your family and look after them." And that person will think that that offer is fantastic and say yes. But actually, they're tricked into it, they're coerced into it, and they're moved from their home country, from A to the UK, B, for the purposes of exploitation. When they reach the UK, they're told by their traffickers that they owe more money than they were originally told. And so they enter into a form of what we call debt labour, which is the next form, where they're forced to work to pay off a debt. And so we see human trafficking being used in most forms of modern slavery, if not all, to transport someone so that they can be exploited at the destination. And often we do see people go from A to B to C. I can just see the chat going up. So, Cheryl, is the echo gone, or is it still there? Just so that I know.
Just to let you know, you are still echoing.
Okay.
Do you want to mute and then unmute and just see if that helps? Oh,
great. Is that better?
that is actually a lot better. Thank you.
Oh,
Lily.
fantastic. Okay, great. I'm pleased that's so much better. So, yes, human trafficking is the transportation of a person from A to B for exploitation. And often when they're trafficked, they will be told that they owe a certain amount of money, and then they will be forced to pay back that money in forced labour. So they enter into debt labour. They're forced to work to pay off a debt that they have. And then the last form of modern slavery we see is descent-based slavery. That is where someone is born into slavery, and that still happens across the world. It's not as common in the UK, but you will see it in communities where there are caste systems in place. So in countries like India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Mauritania, Nigeria, Niger, we see a lot of descent-based slavery happening there. So just some statistics for you. I mentioned that there are about 50 million people living in modern slavery. About just under 28 million are in forced labour. About 12 million of these are women and girls, and 3.3 million are children. There are 22 million people in forced marriage. That is one of the most common forms of modern slavery. And 6.3 million people are in forced commercial sexual exploitation. And about 3.9 million people are in state-imposed forced labour. That is where the government is forcing someone to work against their will. I'll just turn my camera on and hopefully you can see me again. That should be good. So, what do we do about it at Anti-Slavery International? So we have 4 main strategic areas. I'm going to give a little overview of 2 of them, but I just wanted to tell you them all. So we look at child slavery, where we work in countries like Ghana and Tanzania, where children are forced to beg in the streets for money to pay for tuition fees, or they're forced into domestic servitude, where they're in child slavery and domestic servitude. And so we work with communities to try and bring children out of those situations. And then there's migration and trafficking, which I'll come on to in a second in a bit more detail for you. Climate change as well. I want to talk about that because that's very well linked with migration and trafficking. And then there's responsible business and human rights. So just to look at migration and trafficking. So migrant workers are 3 times more likely to end up in forced labour exploitation in the private sector than local workers. And 45% of all identified victims of trafficking in 2022 have been trafficked across international borders. And so we see a clear correlation between people who are migrating into a country and trafficking. And this is something to be aware of in your neighbourhoods. If you have people who have entered the UK via regular means or irregular means, they are likely to be exploited. And so in your communities, look out for those people where the UK isn't their home. Check, like, do they know their rights in the country? In the county that they're living in? Do they have access to help when they need help? Do they know who to contact if they're being exploited? What is their work situation like? Befriend people who aren't born and raised in the UK, where this isn't their normal environment, where they don't understand the norms and the culture and are more easily exploited. So just, think about those things in your local areas. But also, we do a lot of different things here in the UK. So firstly, we host the Anti-Trafficking Monitoring Group. Now, we call it the ATMG because Anti-Trafficking Monitoring Group can be a bit of a mouthful to say all the time. But the ATMG is a collection of about 18 different organisations who were set up to monitor the UK government's adherence to anti-trafficking legislation. And recently they've been campaigning against some of the laws that have been coming into place, such as the Illegal Migration Act and the Nationality and Borders Act, which if you have any questions about those acts and how they impact trafficking, please do ask me at the end, but I am aware of time. But mostly what we do is research that is survivor focused and survivor led. So we work with people who have already been exploited in the UK, who've been able to find help, and we ask them how we can improve supporting survivors of trafficking in the UK and how we can continue stopping trafficking happening in the first place, not just from abroad, but in the UK. How can we help people and children who are caught up in county lines, people who are homeless from being exploited as well. So as I said, that's what the ATMG do, and that's linked in with our research and our advocacy. But we also support migrant workers, for instance, in Mauritius. So in Mauritius, we see a lot of people migrating from Madagascar to Mauritius for work. And actually, when they migrate to Mauritius, they don't know their rights, and they're often exploited by recruitment agencies who say, oh, well, if you pay us £500, we will get you a job, but then you'll owe us back, 100% in interest on that £500, and we want you to pay us some of your salary. But also the jobs they're put into have really poor working conditions, living conditions, and we see migrant workers in Mauritius continually being exploited and taken advantage of. And so in 22, we worked with the Mauritius Migrant Resource Centre along with different trade unions, and we have a business partnership with ASOS, and we created something called the Migrant Workers app. And this is an app that helps migrant workers understand their rights. And it provides details on what the laws say, what recruiters can and can't do, as well as give them information on who to reach out to when they're exploited, and remedies when rights have been violated. And it's a very easy to use app. It's written in 3 different languages. I think it's Malagasy, I can't remember what language they speak in Mauritanian, it's gone from my head, and English. And so it helps people understand their rights. And it's actually a pilot program that we're hoping will be replicated elsewhere. Everyone seems to have a smartphone these days, no matter what country you're in. I think it's a misconception to think people don't have phones when they're not necessarily in high or middle income countries, but they do. And so it's a really great project that we're working on to help migration, people who are migrating, stay safe. But then also we're currently doing a lot of in-depth investigations into trafficking routes. How are they set up in the first place? And this plays into our work with the ATMG, trying to fight against different acts coming into Parliament and into UK law that are actually further contributing towards trafficking in the UK. Again, if you have any questions on that, please do ask me at the end. So in your local areas, look out for people who are marginalised on the edge of society, people who maybe they're new to the area, they don't speak a lot of English, and just make sure that they know who to reach out to. And at the end of this talk, I'll give you a telephone number that you can call and give to people if you're worried that they might be in exploitation. Right, I'm going to flick through climate change. So a lot of people may not necessarily link climate change to modern slavery, but it's really important that we do, because actually by 2050, the World Bank estimates that about 143 million people will have been forced from their homes because of climate change from sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. So that's 143 million people who are going to be vulnerable because they're forced to move. And so I've got this little diagram here. We call it the vicious cycle, and I'll go through each different part of it to help you really understand the links between climate change and modern slavery. So we see that climate change is rendering rural livelihoods more precariously. It's making people more vulnerable because of extreme temperatures, unpredictable rain patterns, loss of biodiversity, insufficient access to clean water, and all of these interact with existing economic marginalization to threaten the viability of small-scale agricultural and fishing areas. And a lot of rural communities are reliant on land for everything, whether that's food security, economic security, many different parts of their life are dependent on land. And so climate change increases these economic and environmental vulnerabilities. And without suitable policies to support these rural communities, we're seeing a loss of food security. We're seeing damages to physical and emotional well-being. And again, this heightens economic precarity, and it drives migration. And so we've gone from climate change to economic and environmental vulnerabilities, deepening exclusion and marginalization. But what we see is when people are forced to migrate, they face a greater risk of human trafficking and forced labor. They're often using routes that are already established, that traffickers recognize as key migration routes. And because they're moving from a place they've known their whole life to a new area where they don't know the culture, they may not know the language, they're trying to find a better life for themselves or their family, traffickers are taking advantage of this. And so all of their ties to their previous communities are cut, and they're left on their own. And in the worst case scenario, modern slavery happens and they're exploited and they enter into debt bondage. They may be tricked again into saying, oh, if you give us £100, we'll give you a job. Oh, actually, you owe us 1,000% interest on that £100. And this is legitimate. This is what happens. The interest rates on loans can be huge for people in exploitation. But then we also see people enter into forced labor. They're forced to work against their will in conditions that are unsafe. We see sexual exploitation as well, where people are desperate for income, that they'll say yes to job opportunities, and before they know it, they are tricked into sex trafficking and exploitation. But also what we see is the activities that people are forced into actually contribute towards environmental devastation. These are extractive industries and agricultural businesses in particular that are contributing to climate emissions, and they're damaging land and water that ordinary people rely on. And so people are often put into forced labor in mining and cash cropping, and these are associated with labor and sexual exploitation. And so the very forms of exploitation, the very different things that people are forced to do against their will, activities, are damaging the environment and causing climate change. And we see this cycle happen time and time again. I hope that has cleared up the link. Again, if you have any questions, please save them for the end. And of course, this will be affecting the UK and our supply chains. You know, think about where you buy your fruit and vegetables from. The labour used to grow those fruit and vegetables may come from people who've been forced to migrate because of climate change and been exploited to work on farms against their will for little pay, or they may be forced to work to pay off a debt because they had to pay someone to transport them there in the first place. And so it's just something to bear in mind when you are buying different things. There are some great websites you can go to. The Ethical Consumer is a great website. Know the Chain is a great website, and just have a look and see what people are doing and companies are doing to tackle modern slavery found in their supply chains, but also climate change in their supply chains. What are they doing to help protect the environment? And just a few little things on our work on climate change before I move on to the signs and what you guys can do yourselves. So we do provide legal protection, and we're campaigning for national and international levels to make sure that climate change is recognised as contributing to modern slavery. And we want the people who are most vulnerable to have those protections in place. We also want to see a just transition into renewable energy. Often, you know, the technology that is used in renewable energy has links to modern slavery. The solar power industry is heavily linked to forced labor in the Uyghur region in China, because solar panels require a very specific resource, where I think 90% of the world's deposits of that resource are found in China, in a region where 1 million people are enslaved and in forced labor. And so we want to make sure when we're transitioning into you know, renewable energy, that we're not causing anyone else to be further vulnerable to exploitation and modern slavery. But also we have a real key passion for leaving no one behind, and making sure that as we move to these different transitions, we're including rural agricultural communities and indigenous populations in the solutions, as well as giving them access to the just transition sort of renewable technology that we're coming up with. And we want to make sure that communities who've been affected by climate change, the very communities who are having to migrate in the first place, have access to the tools needed to protect them so that they don't have to migrate in future. And so before I finish, I just want to touch on some of the signs of modern slavery, as well as some things that you can do. You can see just at the bottom of this picture, there is the modern slavery helpline number. Please get out your phones right now and put it in. I will not be offended if I see your phone out at this point of my presentation, because more than anything, you need to have this number in your phone, because if you think you've spotted someone in your local area who might be in modern slavery, you need to call this number. And so some of the signs of modern slavery are that someone might appear to be under the control of someone else or reluctant to interact with others. You might see this at a shop when you're just going about your normal shop. You know, look, is there someone who looks really shy, really nervous to be there? Is there someone controlling that person, being quite dominant, quite aggressive towards them? Just look out for these things. They won't have any personal identification on them. And so if you are an employer or you work in HR and you need to have someone's passport to verify or their visa to verify they can work in the UK, if someone says, oh, you know, it might take me a few days to get hold of it, or if someone is hesitant to give it to you straight away because they might need to go and ask the person enslaving them to give them access to it, keep an eye on that, because we do see people in modern slavery in normal day-to-day offices. There was a couple in Bristol who would use people. They enslaved about 17 people, and they would sign them up through recruitment agencies in the UK to do temporary work, and they would only give them access to their belongings when they had to do the HR process. And so just keep an eye out for that, because there may be people in your place of work who may be being exploited. Someone might also have very few personal belongings. They might wear the same clothes or unsuitable clothes to work. If you think about a car wash, we see a lot of people exploited in car washes. And just a note on that, there's a great app you can get on your phone called the Safe Car Wash app. And it will help you identify whether or not the car wash you're using, someone might be exploited there. But if you go to a car wash and someone's wearing jeans and flip-flops, that would be a red flag for me, because that's not protective wear, that's unsuitable. Jeans take forever to dry. I would expect someone to be wearing overalls and proper shoes if they're working in a car wash. You know, I would expect them to not be scared. I'd expect them to want to talk to me and have a friendly conversation about the weather. Brits love to talk about the weather. You know, and if someone is reluctant to talk to you and interact with you and they're not wearing sensible clothing, that would be a red flag for me. They're also not able to move around freely. So, you know, if you do have a work colleague and you want to hang out with them after work, but they keep saying no, it might be that they don't want to hang out with you. But if they're showing any of these other signs, that might be a red flag. For instance, the very bottom sign that I've got here is that they're dropped off and collected for work, always in the same way, especially at unusual times, which might be very early or late at night. Do you have a colleague or do you know someone who's constantly dropped off and collected at unusual times, who always says no to hanging out with you, wears the same clothes to work every day, doesn't have access to their ID, and doesn't want to engage in talking with you? Think about these things. They'll be very reluctant to talk to strangers and authorities as well, because they will have been told that strangers and authorities won't protect them if they come forward. And, you know, we can talk about that in the question if you have any questions on that. But more and more with the bills the government are bringing in, it is actually very difficult for someone who's in modern slavery, who's entered the country via irregular means, to want to come forward. Because under the UK government's new laws, if you've entered the country irregularly, you are not allowed to settle. Whether you're a refugee or whether you've been in modern slavery, you cannot settle here. And so if someone has been trafficked and tricked into coming into the UK against their will or under a false pretense, if they then go to the government or to the police and say, I've been exploited, they will not be allowed to stay here. And they're left in this limbo where the government hasn't started taking people away. I can't think of the word I'm looking for. It hasn't started removing people from the UK. And so, you know, people are put in a state of limbo where they don't know what to do. The government won't protect them. They can't stay. And so it's becoming more and more difficult for people in modern slavery to talk to the authorities, even if they aren't scared of the authorities themselves. They're scared of what will happen to them in that system. And the last sign is they might appear frightened or withdrawn, or they'll show signs of physical or psychological abuse. So just look out for these. And I already mentioned being dropped off and collected for work. It's also worth noting that there'll be often large groups of people dropped off and collected for work at the same time. If you're walking around your neighbourhood, is there a house that is, you know, the windows, the curtains are always closed, large number of people are coming in and out of it? Just keep an eye out for that as well. And finally, 6 things that you can do. You've already done the first one. You've learned about modern slavery. Thank you so much for listening to me. But also subscribe to our emails and follow us on social media, because we are constantly providing information on new laws, new problems, how to fight the fight for freedom. You know, keep learning about this issue. Modern slavery is ever evolving and ever transforming, and it's really important that you stay up to date. Spot the signs. I mentioned them before. You'll have access to these slides and this recording. But please, if you see someone in modern slavery, report it. Don't wait. Even if you're not sure, it is far better that the Modern Slavery Helpline receive 10 calls that don't lead anywhere than miss that one call that could rescue someone. If someone is in immediate danger of physical harm, call the police. But otherwise, call the Modern Slavery Helpline. Thirdly, you can support the movement financially. We are a charity, and if you've been impacted by any of the problems I've talked about or impressed with any of the work we do, please consider making a donation. Even £10 really makes a great difference, and I'll post a link in the chat in a second with a link, and there's also a QR code on the next slide that you can use. Share information with your friends, family, and colleagues. We need everyone involved in tackling modern slavery, and tell them, 1 in every 150 people are in modern slavery. That's more than 2 people on this call alone would be in modern slavery. We need to make it everyone's concern. 5, use your consumer power. Talk to businesses you buy from regularly. If all of you got together and decided to write 1 letter each to a specific corporation and ask them, what are you doing to fight modern slavery? They will reply. They have to reply. You are a potential customer or an existing customer, they want your business, and they will reply. But also use things, as I mentioned, the Ethical Consumer and Know the Chain are 2 great websites you can go to and learn more about the companies you're buying from. And finally, fundraise for us. It is a hard topic, but it doesn't mean fighting it. We can't have fun whilst we fight modern slavery. If you like talent shows, if you like doing dancing, if you like raffles or bric-a-brac sales, even if you like running a marathon, I'm not sure if I would run a marathon, but if you're up for it, let me know. Fundraise for us. It's a great way of raising awareness and telling people about modern slavery, as well as raising money for this cause. Thank you all so much for listening. Here's the QR code if you would like to donate, and if you wanted to donate, if you go to donorbox.org/speaker, then you will see a form to donate. I'm going to post this link in the chat as well so that you will have access to it. My details are also at the bottom if you wanted to make a note of them. But otherwise, I'll hand back over to Cheryl for questions.
Thank you, Lizzie. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. We do have some questions. Can you remind people what the name of the app was? And
Yes.
and also, if you can provide me with the links for the various different things that you've mentioned today, we can then send that to those that have attended today that want to find out a little bit more. They were talking about in the chat. I do apologise. A lot of the chat was about the sound at the beginning and the.
So sorry.
No, not your problem, not your fault at all. Somebody was asking around. Do you work alongside with the GLAA, and as an enforcement agency, environmental health at local authority level? Would you visit premises with them?
Yeah, let me start with the first one. So it was about acts, which acts I mentioned. So the first act that came into place was the Nationality and Borders Act of 2022. And one thing that act did was it said if you have been sentenced to a prison sentence of 12 months or more, you're automatically disqualified from something called the National Referral Mechanism. We call it the NRM, the National Referral Mechanism, and that is the system by which someone is sort of reported as a potential victim of modern slavery, and they'll go through this system through the NRM, and then they'll be given support at the end of the process if they've been identified as a victim of modern slavery. And so the problem with that is anyone who's been involved in drug trafficking, county lines, anyone who's been exploited and forced to work against their will into illicit labor, if they're forced to work in illicit activities around drugs, often those sentences are 12 months at a minimum. And so we see people who are exploited in drug trafficking put in prison for 12 months or more, and then they're completely disqualified from accessing any help. And so there are further problems with the Nationality and Borders Bill, but that's one of the biggest ones. The other act is the Illegal Migration Act of 2023. This came into place in July. And the Illegal Migration Act, it prevents you from settling in the UK if you have entered the UK through irregular means. And so if you are a refugee, you cannot claim asylum here. You cannot settle. If you are a victim of modern slavery, you are automatically disqualified from the national referral mechanism if you've entered through irregular means. But the problem is the government hasn't started, expelling people. And as we saw with the court case earlier last week, the government's plan to transport people to Rwanda has failed. And so, people are now left in this limbo where they can't settle in the UK, but they're not going to be deported yet. And so we see people in these detention centres. If you're a refugee, if you're a genuine refugee and a victim of modern slavery, being put in a detention centre can be traumatizing if you've been put in similar situations whilst you were enslaved or as a refugee during war. But often people are then exploited by traffickers. People will use the fact that you don't want to be in detention. And when you are released on bail, because the government will release you on bail eventually, they will be re-exploited by traffickers. So that's just a little overview of those bills. And then, Cheryl, you mentioned the names of the companies. So I'm just
So if you can send them to me, I can send them to the app. Remember the app?
Yes, the Safe Car Wash. I'm going to pop them in the chat, but
yeah, and there was the other app you were talking about to talk to those that you may feel that have been victims of modern slavery.
Yes.
And also a really interesting question from Sue. It says, if the illegal migration routes are well established and well known, what are the factors that prevent the routes from being disrupted by law enforcement?
Well, I think sometimes they're not well known, and there are always new routes coming. I think when we're talking about climate change and those migration routes, often migration routes are really normal, and they don't, migration routes aren't necessarily illegal routes. They're not irregular routes. They can be normal routes across borders, but traffickers will know these routes and they will exploit them. And I think it's hard because sometimes countries don't take modern slavery seriously and don't take trafficking seriously. And so we do find it difficult in source countries to get people to act, the police to act around these routes. It's also hard. We're talking about vast stretches of land, hundreds of miles, thousands of miles long, and it's very hard to patrol those routes. So it's difficult. There may not be the staff. I think if we're talking about the UK, and if you're talking about small boats crossings, it can be very hard to spot them. It's actually a really small boat in quite a large area of land. We actually at Anti-Slavery International, we don't work with the police directly, so it's a question that I don't know all the answers to. It's a very good question, but I'm sure there are many reasons: lack of staff, lack of awareness. I mean, the government, they sort of like to conflate victims of modern slavery and trafficking with migrants, and they're two completely different people. And it's really important that we separate the two. And so I think because the government aren't doing that, they're not really willing to help us try and help people in these situations as they're entering the UK. There's more I could probably say.
No, that's fine.
Refer to my colleagues who probably
that's
know a little
okay.
bit more.
Yeah, if you can, that would be really good. It'd be interesting to find out what their thoughts are on that. Another question that we've got is, what if somebody tries to help someone, but he or she is reluctant to get help because they're afraid? Should they call the helpline anyway?
Yes, call the helpline. Always call the helpline. I think sometimes the helpline will need an individual to make contact themselves if they want to be rescued, but report it. The police can send non-uniformed officers undercover into these areas, but the helpline can also give you advice on what to do and who to reach out to. So we don't do that ourselves at Anti-Slavery International, because the Modern Slavery Helpline do such a good job of it. And you only need one national helpline. Otherwise, you don't know who to call if you've got 5 different helplines. So they're fantastic. They have caseworkers who are very, very skilled and know the system, know how to help. I actually have 2 friends of mine from university who work there, and I know that they are very, very knowledgeable. So even if that person is reluctant to call them, call the helpline, speak to one of their caseworkers. They will give you advice. It can also be hard for someone in modern slavery to reach out. They may not have access to a phone. And so if you're reporting on a situation where, as I mentioned there might be a house where lots of people are living and they're coming in and out, and it's, boarded up, the windows, the curtains are closed. They may not have access to a phone in there, they may be being controlled. And so, the reason that they caught the house in Bristol was because there were a few different reports on this house, and the police eventually were able to raid it and help these people. And so if no one had made those calls and said this house looks a bit sketchy, it wouldn't have happened. So always call the Modern Slavery Helpline, no matter what. Yeah.
And somebody else mentioned that, could you comment on the nationalities most often caught up in modern slavery? And also that modern slavery isn't just related to trafficking, etc., into the UK, but there are UK nationals that are often caught up in modern slavery as well. Can you provide some examples of that?
Yeah, of course. So there's actually around, I think it's just over 120,000 people in the UK living in modern slavery. So it's very much an issue that we see here. I mentioned county lines before. That's a real huge problem across the UK, where British citizens, often children, UK-born children, are exploited by drug gangs and forced into drug work against their will. And so that's a real common one. But farm work, nail bars, car washes, as I said, that will happen across the UK. Often people will be trafficked in those situations, but we do see a lot of sexual exploitation as well in the UK. We will see people who are vulnerable. Often they're very young. Often they have cut off ties with their family, or they're in poverty, or they're discriminated against. As I said, they will be targeted by traffickers. We'll see a lot of grooming happen of young individuals. In terms of the nationalities that we see in the UK, it really does vary. But there is a huge majority of people from Southeast Asia. So Vietnam is a huge source of trafficking and victims for traffickers to exploit. And there are many case studies where people from Vietnam have been trafficked into the UK, forced to work in drugs trafficking. And then there was one instance where there was a 15-year-old boy, and it took him 14 months to enter into the UK. It took 14 months of traveling. And then when he reached the UK, his traffickers told him that they owed him more money for the journey. And so he was actually forced to water cannabis against his will to pay them back. And the police raided the house. He was arrested. He didn't speak any English, and he was sentenced to 24 months in prison because his lawyer advised him to plead guilty. And then he was deported back home. And so we do see a lot of migrant workers from Vietnam being exploited into drugs trafficking, as well as in nail bars and car washes. We see a lot of people from Eastern Europe as well. Albania is a huge source of people coming into the UK who are trafficked. But to be honest, it often doesn't matter the nationality. As I mentioned, the root causes are poverty, discrimination, and weak systems of law. The victims that you'll see from abroad will probably be here because they've experienced poverty, they've experienced discrimination, or there are weak systems of law in place to prevent them from coming. Yeah, that's what I would say.
And another question, Lizzie, was around the modern slavery helpline. Is that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year?
Yes, all of that. It's 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It's also confidential. So, you don't need to worry. If someone is, I should have mentioned that, if someone is nervous, you can say this is confidential, you know. I think that's really helpful. But yeah.
Perfect. And is there also on the helpline, do you know if there's multi linguists available for non-English speakers?
Yeah, absolutely. There are. I think they have, say, I think it's over 100 languages, something like that, that people speak on the Modern Slavery Helpline. So maybe even over 200, I can't remember. But yes, please do reach out to them. If English isn't your mother tongue, you can talk to them. And I've just seen Janet ask that question again about the GLAA. We don't work with the GLAA. Our work in the UK is mostly focused on research and advocacy work, but there are other organisations in the modern slavery sector that are working with the GLAA. We do work with governments abroad, so we do a lot of work with the Mauritanian government, the Niger government, the government of Mauritius as well. So we have worked with different governments, but we haven't worked with the GLA here. And we do receive funding from the Home Office for certain projects as well, which I find a little bit ironic. But we are funded by the UK government, the Norwegian government, and the US government. They provide some of our funding as well. So whilst we don't work with the GLA.
Yeah. No problem. And there was one other question before we wrap everything up, was around that nail bars and car washing are usual areas, as many of us know. But young children are utilised so often with county lines and just transporting drugs locally. So not forgetting the cuckoo flats, etc., that we often come across in our local areas and local authorities are having to deal with those issues and supporting. It could be our next door neighbour that's had their property cuckooed because of county lines, etc. Again, another form of modern slavery, but it's helping identify what they are and what we can do about those.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned, those signs do apply to children as well. If you see children outside of school hours regularly and often, if you see them wearing dark clothing, trying not to be seen, forced begging is a huge thing here in the UK, especially in London. A lot of people who are on the streets begging on by traffic lights when your car stops, they will be being exploited, but children as well. So just keep an eye out for them. And again, if you're worried about a child, I can give you an example of my sister actually. She's a teacher and she was driving past a petrol garage and she noticed this little girl being pulled quite strongly by a man who had a cap over his head. Clearly didn't want to be seen, and this girl looked a bit distressed, and my sister called me and said, "What do I do?" And I was like, if you think she's in physical harm, call 999, otherwise call the Modern Slavery Helpline. And she was a bit worried about the physical harm, so she called the police. And it turned out that it was just a dad, pulling his daughter along. But she checked it out, and that is the right thing to do. If you see a child who's in distress, and things don't look, if often it's a gut feeling. If there's something in your gut that tells you this is not right, do something about it. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lizzie. And I'm sure that everybody has really, really learned a lot today from you. I've put a slide on the screen, which is a QR code to a very short survey to ask you as participants your views on the webinars that we're doing this week. So it's really, really thankful that you have attended today and hope you've enjoyed today. And what we would like from you is for you to share this information with others. Don't keep it to yourself. Talk with others about modern slavery and human trafficking. It's really an important topic, and it doesn't just start and stop in towns and cities. It happens everywhere. So thank you very much for coming today. Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you for sharing your expertise and with Anti-Slavery International. I think it's a really important work that you do. And thank you for raising the awareness with us today.
Oh, no, thank you so much for having me. And again, if you would like to donate, the link is just in the chat. We would really, really appreciate it. But thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you all so much. Take care. And for everyone that's coming tomorrow, we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you very much, Lizzie.
Bye.
Bye.